My name is Major Camila Rhodes, 38 years old. I'm a military intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency DIA. Call sign, Keystone. Most of my work happens behind closed doors, beneath classified folders, between languages most people don't even realize hold danger. My father says I push paper. Maybe that's why at the signing of a multi-billion-dollar Pacific Security Accord, he introduced me loud enough for everyone to hear. This is my daughter, just a junior aide. She's here to translate if the pens run out of ink. I didn't flinch. I've learned how to stay steady. I nodded, smiled. My job wasn't to make him proud. My job was to listen to everything. It was supposed to be a straightforward event, two nations finalizing a years-long deal. The air in the treaty hall was thick with expectation, cameras silently clicking like ticks under skin. My father, Colonel Daniel Rhodes, stood beside Colonel Miles, the U.S. signatory, beaming with pride as he handed over a pen, his personal gift engraved with the word legacy. But as Miles uncapped it, a sound clicked. It wasn't loud. No one else noticed, but I did. A slight shift in airflow, a change in how the metal settled. It wasn't just a pen. I dropped my folder on purpose. As I knelt, I whispered in Spanish, my voice a razor through velvet, no fear me. El bolígrafo es un arma. Colonel Miles froze. His gaze flicked to me. I didn't blink. Keystone, he murmured. Then he did something few have the courage to do. He put the pen down. The room hesitated. Everyone smiled, thinking it was part of the ceremony. And then, chaos. Through the service doors burst my husband's SEAL unit, Lieutenant Derek Hale, in full tactical gear. They surrounded the table, moved with surgical silence. One of them opened the pen. Inside, nestled inside the ink chamber, was a micro-explosive wired to detonate on contact with a signature, just enough to take out Miles and whoever was closest. My father's face turned gray. His mouth opened, but no words came, because the pen was his gift. And the room that had been ready to cheer now stared at him like he was the enemy. Protocol kicked in immediately. I wasn't applauded. I was detained. Even when you're right, especially when you're right, intelligence officers get isolated after an event like that. Standard procedure. Verify you weren't compromised. Confirm you didn't act on unsanctioned intel. Even heroes get questioned, maybe especially heroes. I was escorted to an empty room in the basement of the compound. No windows, one chair. A single file folder sat on the table. Then came Lieutenant Colonel Forbes, Internal Security. Clean suit, no emotion. Major Rhodes, you saved Colonel Miles's life. That's not the issue. I know. We need to know how you knew. Who tipped you off? I paused. Telling the truth is rarely simple when you're in my line of work. Because my truth wasn't a report. It was a feeling, a whisper, a shadow of a conversation. 2 days before the event, I'd been reviewing multilingual transcripts from an intercepted call chain. I was in the translation bay alone, cleaning up a backlog. That's when I overheard a faint voice from the room next door filtering through the vent. Spanish, Caribbean accent, confident. The words "Cuando firme caerá. El bolígrafo es la bala. When he signs, he'll fall. The pen is the bullet." The name Miguel had floated through. No last name, no context. Just one phrase. At the time, I couldn't risk elevating a partial intercept. Not without proof. So I stayed quiet. Until I heard that click. Until I realized they'd made the pen into a trigger. So you're saying no one told you directly? Forbes pressed. No. I told myself. Because I was listening when no one else was. He stared at me like I was either a genius or a liar. Maybe both. You had no visual confirmation, no intel packet. And yet you intervened during a global treaty event. Yes. Why didn't you report it earlier? Because suspicion is not evidence. He closed the file, then paused. You do understand. You're now part of this investigation. I saved a man's life and nearly destroyed your father's career. I didn't respond. Because the truth is, I didn't mean to humiliate my father. I didn't even mean to act. I just did what I always do. Observe, interpret, act in silence. That's what they trained me for. And yet now I was the anomaly. The variable no one expected. Not the threat. Not the hero. Just the shadow that happened to be standing in the right place at the right time with the right ears. And somehow that made everyone uncomfortable. Even me. I was 9 when I first translated a full argument between two tourists at the DC metro station. A woman from Venezuela had dropped her wallet, and the man chasing her down was shouting in a mix of panic and broken English. No one around understood him except me. I told the station guard exactly what was happening word for word. They caught the pickpocket, returned her wallet. That day I felt something shift in my chest, like I had been handed a tool no one expected me to wield. By the time I was 17, I had mastered Spanish-Portuguese and was auditing Arabic classes at the community college just for fun. My high school counselor called me the quiet interpreter with a nuclear mind. She meant it kindly, but I remember how it stung because even then no one saw me as more than a background asset. I joined the military not to carry a rifle, but to read the language behind the language. I didn't want noise. I wanted meaning. The day I walked into Fort Huachuca for intelligence training, a captain glanced at my height. My file then said, "Oh good, we always need female linguists." Soft voices get into rooms. I didn't say anything. I let them underestimate me. That was my first real weapon. I was deployed to Bogotá at 25, barely through Phase 2 field certification. It was supposed to be a minor attachment set-in on peace talks between border insurgents and allied defense contractors. But on the second day, I noticed something off. In one of the translator's printouts, someone had embedded a cipher in the spacing of the Spanish text, a pattern of dots that didn't match the syntax. It was so subtle, it looked like a printer issue. I stayed up all night cross-checking with a historical cipher book my uncle had mailed me when I was a teenager. The next morning, I handed my commanding officer a sheet of paper that read, "The convoy is marked. Road 47. Midday. Remove air cover." It was a trap. They were planning to lure our team down a narrow canyon, hit them with RPGs, then blame it on a third-party militia. We rerouted. We survived. And for the first time, I was no longer just the quiet interpreter. They called me Keystone after that, because in any structure, the keystone is the one stone that holds everything together. Pull it out and the bridge collapses. I wore the name like armor. I climbed ranks, gathered ribbons I didn't display, and moved in and out of operations without anyone remembering my face, but always remembering what I prevented. Each time it was language that saved lives, not weapons. Context, accent. The way a man said friend instead of ally. Tiny things. And yet, to my father, I was always just the girl with good ears. Even after Bogotá, even after Dakar, even after I decrypted a whispered slur over radio chatter that stopped a drone strike from hitting civilians during a wedding. He never asked what I did. He never called me Keystone. He once introduced me to a colleague at a banquet and said, "This is my daughter Camila. She does something with languages." No pride, no contempt, just distance. Maybe it was because he couldn't control what I knew, or because I worked in shadows while he operated in full view, or maybe I reminded him of the parts of himself he'd buried after Afghanistan, his mistakes, his silence, his own failures to see danger until it bled. Still, I never confronted him. Not when he brushed past me at events, not when he introduced my younger brother's ROTC award like it was a Bronze Star, and not when he walked past me the morning of the treaty event and said, "Stay close, Camila. If the minister forgets a word, maybe you can help him fake it." That wasn't just a jab. That was a reminder I was in his eyes, a convenient ornament, something decorative. But that day when the pen clicked, when I whispered and the SEALs stormed in, when the bomb was found in his gift, that's when the room saw me, not as his daughter, not as a translator, as Keystone. And for the first time, so did he. They didn't cuff him. They didn't raise their voices. 2 military police officers in plain uniform walked into the hallway where my father stood still, pale from the revelation of the microbomb. One of them showed a badge. The other simply said, "We need to ask you a few questions, sir." He looked at the pen again, now sealed in a clear evidence bag labeled Exhibit A. Then he turned to me. His eyes weren't angry, just confused, searching, as if trying to rewind the last 5 minutes and find another explanation, something that didn't involve me. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't even glance at the generals watching through the glass panel beside the security checkpoint. He just asked me one thing. Did you know? His voice was quiet, level, but I could hear the weight in it. Not disappointment, not even accusation, just something heavier, like he already knew the answer but couldn't bring himself to believe it. I nodded. No lies, no ceremony. Just the truth, plain and heavy as steel. He blinked once. Why didn't you tell me the words weren't sharp? They were soft. Not because he doubted my judgment, but because I think he realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. He had never made it easy for me to tell him anything, so I told him the truth. Because you never listened. It wasn't a yell. I didn't spit it like a weapon. I just said it, calm, the way truth deserves to be said. His shoulders dropped not in defeat but in understanding. It was strange. In all the years we'd spoken in clipped sentences, traded cold nods in corridors, and acted like two diplomats forced to share a family name, I had never once seen him quiet like that. Not after my mother died, not after my promotion, not even after the Bogota operation when my name had quietly circulated through defense circles like smoke. But now here in this sterile hallway with 2 MPs standing nearby, his silence finally said something. It said, "You might be right." The MPs waited respectful but firm. He held up a hand not to stop them, but just to give himself a second more. He didn't reach for me, didn't demand an answer, didn't accuse. He just looked at me again, this time with less distance. "Did you think I gave them that pen on purpose?" His voice was lower now, not fragile, just human. "I don't know," I replied, which was the truth. Because in the hours before the summit, I'd heard whispers. I'd seen a partial document under review in the encryption terminal. I'd overheard a private conversation in Spanish that sounded off. And I had seen my father hand-deliver the pen to the colonel with a smile. But I also knew my father wasn't stupid. He was a proud man, flawed, but trained to sense danger. He didn't miss details, unless he wanted to miss them. Unless he had been protecting someone like Miguel Cazares, the civilian diplomat who owed my father more than one favor. Someone who could have planted the mechanism without telling him what was inside. "Would you believe me if I said I didn't know what the pen contained?" he asked. I studied him carefully. I'd spent a lifetime decoding people, but this time there was no cipher, no misdirection. Just a man who looked like he was no longer sure who to defend his career, his conscience, or the version of himself he'd been clinging to. "I believe you didn't want to know," I answered, because knowing would mean choosing. Another silence. Another shift in his face, like something cracked, but not loudly. He turned to the MPs and said, "I'll come with you." As he walked away, I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel vindication. I felt still, like I had finally said something I'd waited 2 decades to say, and now I didn't know what to do with the quiet that followed. Later, when I was called in for a follow-up debrief, the investigator asked, "Do you think your father was complicit?" I looked at the file, then out the window. "No," I said, but I think he ignored a warning sign because it came from me. They didn't write that down, but I knew it was the most honest line spoken in that entire building. When I was little, my father's uniform was magic. It smelled like starch and discipline. It gleamed with metals I couldn't name but admired with childish awe. The sharp lines of his jacket felt like armor, and I believed with all my heart that nothing bad could happen when he stood beside me. He taught me to salute before I learned to multiply. He showed me how to stand tall when singing the anthem, how to tuck my chin slightly when facing the flag. He wasn't soft, not the way other dads were, but he was steady. And for a child like me, steady was enough to feel safe. We had our rituals. Saturday mornings, he'd wake me early and say, "Let's earn breakfast." That meant running 2 miles, then practicing kata drills in the backyard, while the sun cut sharp angles across the fence. I'd follow his movements like a shadow, eager to please, desperate for praise. When I bruised my elbow during a high block, he didn't coddle me. He nodded once and said, "You remembered to pivot your foot." That's good. That was love in his language. But love changes shape as you grow, or maybe it just becomes harder to read. When I turned 14, I told him I wanted to study languages, Spanish specifically. I'd already been listening to Spanish broadcasts, reading poetry, watching dubbed films. I loved how meaning shifted through tone, how one word could have 3 intentions depending on who said it. He barely looked up from his classified files. "Languages won't stop a bullet," he said. When I joined the intelligence track at the academy instead of combat training, he went silent for a week. Not angry, just invisible. Like I had chosen a path he couldn't walk with me. Still, I kept trying. When I graduated top of my class in field cryptography, I emailed him the news. No reply. When I was deployed to Bogota and helped intercept a data burst that saved 17 lives, he sent a 3-word message: good timing. Dad. When I was promoted to major, I finally visited him. I wore my dress blues. My insignia was sharp. My heels clicked just like his had. I walked in tall, saluted clean, and said, "Major Camila Rhodes reporting, sir." He looked up, expression unreadable. Then he said, "Beneath that office polish, you're still a trainee with no calluses." It wasn't a joke. There was no smirk, no gleam of humor. Just a statement, flat, factual, dismissive. I laughed. That was my defense mechanism. I always laughed when he cut deep. But inside, something cracked. A fine fracture beneath the surface. Not enough to break me, just enough to sting every time I tried to be proud of myself afterward. I kept the laughter going. I made coffee. I asked about his garden. I left before the silence drowned us both. On the drive back to base, I looked at myself in the mirror and said out loud, "You are not small." Because sometimes that's what daughters of great men have to remind themselves, especially when those men never learned how to say, "I'm proud of you." Still, I never stopped hoping. I kept forwarding reports when I got commendations. I mailed him the front page when I received the Bronze Star. He never replied. I even invited him to the Pentagon luncheon, where I was recognized for operational excellence. He sent a courier with flowers. The card said, "Duty first." I don't know if he meant it as encouragement or apology. Maybe both, maybe neither. Over the years, I've watched other fathers lift their daughters into the spotlight. Mine always stood behind me, stone-faced, silent, arms crossed. Not in disapproval, but in calculated distance. As if my success was something fragile, temporary, or maybe not entirely earned. But that distance, it shaped me. It made me sharper, more exacting. It drove me to be the kind of officer who didn't just anticipate the enemy, but who also anticipated the people meant to be on her side. And in a strange way, it prepared me for that day at the treaty signing. Because when I looked at the pen, his pen, and felt the twist in my gut, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait to be seen. I acted. Because if my father had taught me anything, it was that you don't wait for affirmation. You build your own certainty, even if the person you wanted to impress the most never looks back. And that's how I survived in his shadow, by learning not to shrink inside it. They gave us a room with no windows and 2 chairs bolted to the floor because apparently national embarrassment requires hardware. I sat across from my father, not General Rhodes, not the man with 3 stars on his shoulder and a 1,000-yard stare that could melt steel. Just my father. His jaw was locked tight. The muscle near his temple pulsed like it always did when he was holding something in. Then he spoke. "Miguel saved my life," he said. No preamble, no apology, just fact. Peru, 12 years ago, a roadside bomb took out our convoy. Miguel dragged me from the wreckage. I would have died if he hadn't pulled me clear of the second blast. I blinked. I hadn't known that. I thought I knew every scar he carried, every story etched into the corners of his eyes. But this one, he'd kept this one buried. He never asked for anything afterward. He continued. Disappeared into the jungle with a busted leg and a busted rifle. I tried to find him. DIA said he was ex-FARC. Then he was dead. That's what they told me. And yet I said softly, "He's not." My father's eyes stayed on mine. Apparently, not. He ran a hand through his silver hair. That was the first time I realized how old he looked under the overhead light. Like something inside him had aged faster than the rest. "Miguel showed up last month," he said. He looked different, scarred, tired. Said he was working in private security now. He handed me the pen and said, "For old times." I didn't question it. I leaned forward. "You didn't run it through any scan." His voice hardened. "It was sentimental." I nodded once slowly. "So was the wedding ring that exploded in Cyprus last year. That landed." His mouth opened, then shut. He stood abruptly, paced 2 steps, stopped. That old rigidity returned to his posture, military habit, clashing with moral unease. "I didn't think," he began. "No," I cut in gently. "You didn't." He turned to face me, and there was something unfamiliar in his expression. Not anger, not pride, not even disappointment, doubt. It sat awkwardly on his face like a uniform that didn't fit anymore. He cleared his throat. "Are you here to interrogate me, Camila, or to gloat?" "I'm here," I said. Because I want to understand how the man who taught me to question everything trusted the one person he never should have. He sat back down. I continued. Miguel is smart. He didn't come back as a friend. He came back because he knew you remembered that debt. Because he knew you'd let your guard down. You're not the only one who studied human behavior, sir. His fingers curled slightly. I suppose you think I'm a fool. No, I said. I think you're human. That surprised him. He glanced at me, unsure if it was an insult or a reprieve. You built your whole life on loyalty, I said. It made you a good soldier, a good leader. But blind loyalty is a liability in intelligence. You taught me that even if you didn't realize it. He looked at me like he was seeing me differently, maybe for the first time, not as a daughter, but as a peer. Then he asked, did you know about Miguel before today? I met his gaze evenly. Not everything, but enough. Why didn't you tell me? I paused. Because that question carried years behind it. Years of me trying to tell him things he didn't want to hear. Years of being met with silence or redirection or a short clipped, I'll handle it. So I told the truth. Because you've never listened to me. His mouth twitched almost like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he just sat there, silent, still. The kind of stillness that isn't anger, but self-examination. That's when I saw it, the flicker. The faintest tremor of realization behind his eyes. Not regret, not yet, but a shift, the beginning of it. And I understood something then. Miguel may have planted the device. But the real danger, the real failure wasn't in the pen. It was in the assumption that only warriors see clearly, that only those who carry rifles understand threat, that analysts, linguists, aides like me were just background noise. My father was many things, but in that moment he was a man confronting the cost of his own blind spots. And I wasn't there to punish him. I was there to make sure he finally saw. The first headline I saw was on a defense blog. Translator Aide prevents bombing at treaty signing. The next one on a viral TikTok account read, "Who is the woman who whispered in Spanish and saved a colonel's life?" And then came the one that stung the most. Just lucky questions surround Aide's role in pen bomb foil. By the time I was released from internal isolation and cleared of any procedural wrongdoing, my name Camila Rhodes was trending in small corners of the internet, but not as a major. Not as an intelligence officer with 12 years of decorated service under the Defense Intelligence Agency. No. To the public, I was still the junior aide who whispered something in Spanish. No call sign, no background, no context. Just a woman who'd happened to be there. The Pentagon made no official statement, understandable given the classified nature of what almost happened. But silence breeds speculation. And in the void, everyone filled in their own version of me. The military blogs debated my credibility. She wasn't even on the official intel roster for the summit. Why would a translator have access to high-level signals? Is this just PR cleanup for a failed security sweep? Civilians on Reddit made memes about it. One showed a woman in a business suit photoshopped into an action movie poster, holding a pen like it was a grenade. Caption: when your day job is Microsoft Word but you moonlight as 007. I didn't laugh. Then came the backlash I should have seen coming, but somehow still felt like a punch. A female analyst stops a bombing with one whisper. Sounds like feminist fan fiction, bilingual and brave. Either she's fake or secretly CIA. Bet she got a medal and a book deal already. I didn't. Not even a commendation. Not that I expected one. Because the real work, the kind that matters, doesn't get medals. It doesn't get trending hashtags or viral videos or celebratory parades. It gets your clearance reviewed, your loyalty questioned, your methods scrutinized, especially when you don't fit the uniformed fantasy of a hero. But that was fine. I wasn't looking for a headline. I was looking for truth. Inside the agency, the conversation was different but just as sharp. Colonel Miles requested an official commendation for me. His exact words in the memo: Rhodes acted swiftly and saved lives. I trust her instincts, her discretion, and her language skills more than most combat-trained personnel I've served with. It was generous, earned, and promptly buried. The review board didn't say no, they just didn't say yes. My CO said it was under review. That's code for let's wait until the noise dies down. But noise has a way of echoing even in soundproof rooms. Some of my peers rallied behind me, especially the women, and especially those who'd ever been mistaken for assistants. when they were actually analysts, strategists, or cryptographers. But others pulled away. They nodded stiffly in hallways, avoided eye contact during briefings, referred to me only as the Aide from the treaty debacle. They weren't cruel, just uncertain, as if I'd become something unstable. A variable they hadn't accounted for. I understood. In intelligence, unpredictability is a liability even when it's what saves you. So I said nothing. No interviews, no clarifications, no leaked memoirs or anonymous sources. I returned to my work, classified files, surveillance logs, deep analysis of voice patterns and diplomatic transcripts, all the invisible threads that hold the fabric together. I didn't need the world to know me, because in silence truth grows deeper roots, and I'd already learned that the most important things I've ever said were the ones only one person needed to hear. So when strangers online mocked me, I let them. When analysts whispered doubts in secure corridors, I let them. And when a young intel trainee in the cafeteria shyly approached me and said, "I watched that clip. I'm learning Spanish now. Because of you," I just smiled and told her, "It'll save lives. Trust me." Because sometimes silence is not weakness. It's restraint. It's strength. It's choosing not to feed a machine that forgets women like me the moment we stop being useful. And while the world argued about what I was or wasn't, I quietly became something more powerful than a viral name. I became undeniable. I found Derek where I always expected him to be after a mission, not at headquarters, not in a debriefing room, but seated on a metal stool inside the medbay's weapons cleaning bay, wiping down the slide of his sidearm with quiet precision. The room smelled faintly of gun oil and antiseptic. Everything was sterile, except him. He looked up when he heard the door. His eyes didn't flicker with surprise, just quiet knowing. I sat beside him, not on a chair, but on the floor, my knees drawn to my chest. My hands wrapped around them like a fortress. I didn't speak right away. The silence between us was gentle, not awkward, not cold, just familiar. "They said I was reckless," I finally murmured. He didn't stop cleaning. He just shifted his grip on the cloth. "You weren't." "They're reviewing my clearance again." I traced the grout lines between the tiles with my fingertip. Derek set the cloth down slowly, carefully, like each gesture had weight. "They review everyone's when things get uncomfortable. That's bureaucracy's way of pretending it's doing something useful. I'm being called a translator with a hero complex." My voice didn't shake, but it scratched like gravel. He reached over to the tray next to him, picked up a small folded item, and extended it toward me. It was a paperclip. Bent, twisted, just so. A shape I'd molded absent-mindedly months ago while sitting on his bunk, waiting for him to get out of the shower. I'd clipped it onto his dog tags before he deployed last. A silly gesture. Or so I thought. He held it between us now like a sacred object. "I've kept it with me, every op, every step," he said softly. "It was never silly, Cam." I took it from his hand, my fingers brushing his. "You knew I always knew." His eyes met mine, calm, grounded, "that you were right, that you saw what others missed, that you said the words no one else could, and that you'd carry the blame for it, because that's how quiet courage works." I didn't cry. I didn't let my lip tremble or my eyes mist. But my back, which had held straight through every interrogation, every headline, every meeting with command, I let it fold just enough to lean sideways and rest my head against his shoulder. It wasn't because I was tired or broken. It wasn't surrender. It was trust. For the first time since the treaty, I didn't feel like I had to brace against the world. "You didn't tell me everything," he added, voice low. "I couldn't," I whispered. "Not because I didn't trust you, because I needed to make sure it wasn't a ghost. Miguel." I nodded. "He's a phantom in 10 different files. Nothing solid. Just whispers, like a shadow only seen out the corner of your eye. And now I exhaled, he's real. And dangerous." Derek shifted slightly enough to let my head settle more fully into the crook of his shoulder. "Then we find the trail, together." I turned to look up at him. "Even if it leads somewhere no one wants us to go," he smiled faintly. "Cam, I married a woman who once convinced an entire joint task force that an encrypted poem was a missile launch code. There's nowhere you go that I won't follow." For a moment we just sat. No drama, no dramatic music, Just two people who'd worn different uniforms, fought different wars, and now shared the same quiet battlefield called belief. His hand found mine, not to hold it, just to touch. And then he said what I didn't even realize I needed to hear. Let them talk. Let them doubt. You're not here to win applause. What am I here for then, I asked. He looked at me like it was obvious. You're here to keep bridges from falling. That's what Keystone does. I looked down at the clip still in my hand. The bent wire, once a casual fidget, was now a signal, a thread, a signpost of faith. I tucked it into the sleeve of my uniform just beneath the insignia, a reminder that even when the world refused to call me by my name, someone always did. And that was enough to keep going. It took 3 official requests and 1 favor from a friend in legal, but I finally got access to the detainment transcripts. No one said it aloud, but I knew what they were really thinking. She's too close. She shouldn't be allowed to review this. But protocol didn't explicitly bar me, and I was careful to remain calm, procedural. They handed over the evidence packet in a sealed manila folder, time-stamped and red-flagged. My clearance let me into the small, secure listening room behind HQ. No windows, just a desk, a recorder, and headphones too large for the shape of my head. I took a breath, inserted the first audio file. Miguel's voice played back, calm, precise, chilling in how casual it sounded. He was speaking in Spanish, but the dialect was Colombian, not Mexican. I caught the subtle shift instantly. That detail alone could have misled half the translation team. Rhodes still trusts me, he said, laughing softly. The old soldier sees the world in lines of honor, but honor makes you blind. I paused the recording. My fingers trembled. I rewound 5 seconds. Hit play again. Rhodes still trusts me. The old soldier sees the world in lines of honor, but honor makes you blind. He was talking about my father. And not just that, he was talking about him like a pawn, not a partner, not a co-conspirator. I leaned back, my mind spinning in too many directions at once. This wasn't some rogue gift passed along out of camaraderie. Miguel had known exactly how my father would receive the pen. He'd used the one thing no security scanner could detect: trust. I thought of my father's face after the incident, how it crumpled not with rage, but with something much harder to watch: realization. And now I understood why. He wasn't the architect of the near assassination. He was a liability in someone else's design. That should have comforted me. It didn't. Because weakness isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's just as dangerous. I clicked into the second file. This time it was Miguel being questioned by intelligence. Most of it was redacted. The rest was noise, stonewalling, cryptic remarks, a man who knew which parts of silence were his best weapon. But buried in minute 27, I heard it. They don't vet family attachments the way they should. The daughter's too clever, too careful. But the father, he still thinks loyalty is something owed. That did it. I sat frozen for a full minute, then shut off the playback. I stared at the wall, not the kind of stare that sees anything, just the kind that tries to keep from breaking open. I'd spent months telling myself my father didn't trust me because I wasn't a real soldier, because I was the daughter who read threats in patterns, not in gunfire. But it wasn't me he misunderstood. It was himself. He thought the world still operated in black and white honor. He believed that Miguel's past heroism, the rescue in Peru, the scars from that burning Jeep, had bought him permanent loyalty. But loyalty isn't a currency you save in the bank. It expires. Or worse, it gets used against you. And for all his stripes, all his campaigns. My father had no idea how to see a friend turning into a threat. I wanted to scream, to throw something, but I didn't. Instead, I wrote a note, just one line. You were betrayed because you believed in the better version of people. That's not weakness, but it needs a guardrail. I didn't send it. I folded it and placed it in the inner lining of my uniform pocket. Not for him, for me. Because no matter how much I wanted to forgive him outright, I had to hold 2 truths at once: that he didn't know and that he let himself not know. That was the ache, not betrayal, but disappointment. Because if Miguel had fooled a man like my father, decorated, disciplined, respected, what hope did anyone else have? I walked out of the room quieter than when I entered, but not softer. No, something in me had steeled, hardened. I was no longer looking to clear my father's name. I was looking to understand how many bridges Miguel had crossed under the flag of brotherhood. Because keystone doesn't just hold up the structure. It keeps the cracks from spreading. There's a rule in intel. When something doesn't add up, go back to the tape. People lie. Paper trails can be edited. But footage, especially when it's not supposed to matter, tends to tell the truth. I pulled access logs and security camera footage from the east wing of the command center. The system was clean. Almost too clean. The bomb had been planted during a window where all cameras facing the briefing hall showed signal interference. A convenient glitch. But the hallway cameras, the ones by the side access doors, still intact. Miguel didn't enter through the main gate. He didn't go through metal detectors. He bypassed 3 levels of security and appeared on camera near the restricted conference entrance at 06:04 hours, 2 minutes before the pen was placed. He used a VIP clearance badge, issued under my father's signature. I paused the frame. There it was, Miguel's hand reaching for the scanner. The badge glinting under the motion sensor light. The automated lock giving way like a trained guard dog obeying a familiar voice. I stared at the screen for a long time. My stomach churned. I opened the personnel badge logs. My father had approved one-off clearance for diplomatic observer, Miguel Alvarez. Entry classified as cultural liaison, authorized for a private debrief on regional trade cooperation. It was filed under non-sensitive clearance. No background revetting, no second signature required. I knew what this meant. My father, Colonel Rhodes, didn't authorize a security breach. He granted access because he still believed Miguel was the man who dragged him from a burning convoy in Peru. The man who earned his stripes, even without a uniform. He signed that badge the way a brother leaves the front door unlocked without hesitation. I closed the logs, sat still, then I compiled a short dossier. Time-stamped stills, clearance documentation, side-by-side entries. The trail was undeniable. Miguel entered as a friend, and used that trust like a knife. I requested an immediate command review. The senior officers met in the Situation Room that afternoon. I was summoned after 20 minutes of discussion. Brigadier General Kane looked over her glasses. She was known for her cold read of people, less known for her empathy. She tapped her pen once. You believe Colonel Rhodes was complicit? I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. I believe he made a decision rooted in history, not evidence. That's a diplomatic answer, another officer said. Colonel DeSantis, Army Intelligence. He narrowed his eyes. Do you think your father is guilty? Silence. I swallowed. Then said it exactly as it was living in my chest. I think he trusted the wrong man, and now he needs a chance to make it right. The room stilled. I didn't raise my voice, didn't plead. I wasn't there to defend him blindly. I was there to show them that the line between mistake and malice was often drawn in hindsight. But responsibility remains. That one sentence, half accusation, half rescue line, hung in the air. I waited. General Kane finally nodded. Proceed. Bring the footage to the Inspector General. We'll initiate a full internal review. And Major Rhodes, she looked at me not with suspicion but with something quieter. Respect, maybe. Or caution. You're too close to this, but you're also the reason we even caught it. That counts. I left the room with the folder clutched tight. Later that evening, I found my father sitting alone outside the base chapel, not praying, just still. He didn't look at me, but he said he used me. I sat beside him. He added, You knew it before I did. I didn't respond. He turned. You're not saying I shouldn't have trusted anyone ever again, are you? I met his eyes. No, sir. I'm saying you should have trusted me. He nodded slowly. Then after a beat, Does it help? Knowing I meant well. It helps, I said gently. Knowing you finally see the difference between meaning well and doing right. That was enough for now. The investigation would go on. Repercussions would fall. But in that moment, under the soft hum of the security lights outside the chapel, I knew one thing clearly. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means seeing the truth and choosing to carry it with both hands. It was just after 2100 hours when I knocked on his office door. The base had quieted into its usual hum-low generators, distant footsteps, and the occasional click of typewriter keys from the night admin wing. But in his room, it was silence. He didn't say, Come in. He knew it was me. I stepped inside. My father was sitting on the edge of his bunk, already out of uniform, but not yet at ease. He was holding a worn letter in his hand, folded and refolded into a perfect square. I didn't ask what it was. It wasn't the time. He looked at me like he was seeing something both familiar and painfully distant. "Camilla," he began, voice steady, "if you think I should, I'll resign." He didn't dress it up, no speeches, no denial, just an offer. Like it was something he'd already said to himself 100 times. I stayed standing. He went on, "I understand the optics. I authorized access without re-verification. I ignored protocol. I failed the standard I drilled into every officer for 3 decades. His jaw clenched. "If I stay, it'll taint everything." I walked to the window where a sliver of moonlight touched the sill. I didn't answer right away. When I finally turned, I said, "If you step down now, people will write the ending for you. They'll say you turned a blind eye, or worse, that you were part of it." He looked away. I continued, "But if you stay, if you stand there and face it, face what it means to be wrong out loud, then no one else can own your story. You will." He didn't speak, but I saw something shift in his eyes. A slow cracking of the shield. He always wore the kind of shield made not of arrogance, but of old metals, and the weight of pride passed down like a uniform that never quite fit. "You really think I should stay?" he said finally. It wasn't a question. It was him checking if I meant it. Not as his daughter, but as a fellow officer. I nodded. "You made a mistake, sir. But you also raised a daughter who caught it before it killed someone. That means something." He gave a tired half-laugh. "I used to think my legacy would be the campaigns I led. The ribbons, the plaques." I sat on the edge of the desk across from him. "Now it can be the truth you didn't run from." We sat there in silence for a moment. Then he whispered, "I wanted to believe in him. Miguel saved my life once. It's hard to imagine someone you owe everything to would turn and use that debt as leverage. I finished for him." He met my eyes. I should have known better. I shook my head gently. "Maybe. Or maybe you just believed too deeply in what he once was, and not in what he became." He pressed the folded letter to his knee. "I failed the standard, but I don't want to fail the reckoning." I breathed slowly. "Then don't." He walked to his small cabinet and poured 2 cups of black coffee from a metal thermos. No sugar, no cream. Just like he taught me when I was 16 and begged to come with him on early drills. He handed me a cup. We didn't toast, but he said, "You did good work, Camilla, not just with the case, with me." I didn't smile, but something in me warmed. Then I added quietly, "You know, if you ever want to tell your story, not the cleaned-up one for official review, but the real version, I'll be the first to listen." He gave me a long look, then nodded. "I think I'd like that." We sat down side by side, coffee between our hands, like an old truce being re-signed. He didn't resign that night. He didn't try to hide behind his rank, or the flag, or the years of service he'd stacked like armor. Instead, he stayed. And for the first time in my life, I saw the man I once saluted, not as a distant figure in perfect formation, but as someone human enough to face himself and brave enough not to flinch. The hearing room was colder than I remembered it, not in temperature but in tone. Sterile quiet, stripped of ceremony. No salutes, no flags unfurled. Just a long elevated bench where 5 senior officers sat in partial shadow and rows of worn chairs facing them. I sat in the back. My name wasn't on the agenda that day. I wasn't giving testimony. I wasn't even required to attend. But I needed to be there, not as Major Camila Rhodes, linguist and intelligence officer, as his daughter. My father walked into the chamber at 0900 sharp. Full dress uniform, silver eagle still pinned, though his step felt slower than usual, like every medal weighed double now. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't need to. His eyes went straight to the council. "Colonel Daniel Rhodes, the lead officer, began. You've requested to address this hearing prior to final deliberations. You may proceed." My father didn't clear his throat. He didn't shuffle notes. He simply stood, hands at his sides. "I'm here today not to defend my record," he said. "That record is written. You've read it." He let that hang for a moment before continuing. "I'm here to admit where I failed." Silence. "Absolute," he went on. "I authorized an individual, Miguel Aguado, onto a secure facility under my credentials. That alone was a breach of protocol." He inhaled, then added I did it not out of negligence, but out of trust. Years ago, Miguel saved my life during a mission in Peru. Since then, I considered him a friend, someone whose character I believed in without reevaluation. He paused. I was wrong. A murmur passed through a few rows in front. He didn't flinch. I failed to re-verify. I failed to question a gift. I let personal sentiment cloud my professional judgment. And because of that, an assassination attempt nearly succeeded right under my watch. He didn't look for reaction, didn't blink. I accept full responsibility for that lapse. I do not blame my staff, my unit, or my daughter, who in truth prevented this from becoming a national tragedy. My heart stopped. That was the first time he'd acknowledged it publicly. My part, my role. She acted where I hesitated. She listened when I assumed. And that difference may be what saved a man's life. He turned slightly to address the room now, not just the council. I was raised to believe rank justified rightness, that seniority equaled clarity. But I stand here today because a junior officer reminded me that truth doesn't bow to age or rank or history. Still no applause, no nods, just stillness, which somehow felt louder. He faced the council again. I offer no excuse, only clarity. I request that disciplinary action, if necessary, be placed solely on me, but I ask that the full record show that when truth arrived, even from unexpected lips, I did not run. He stepped back, saluted, sat. The council said nothing at first. The presiding officer simply said noted and moved to the next agenda item. But something had changed. I could feel it not in words, but in the silence that followed. No one whispered accusations anymore. No one looked at him with the smug expression of a predator circling a wounded lion. Instead, they listened. And they remembered. Because few things are rarer in uniform than a man of rank admitting he was wrong without flinching, without spin, and without a shield of protocol. After the session ended, I waited outside the building. When my father stepped out, he looked older but lighter. He didn't ask how he did. He didn't explain his choices. He just said, "Thank you for being there." I nodded. "You didn't have to come," he added. "I did," I replied. "Because I wanted to see you stand." He looked at me. And for the first time, I saw something in his gaze I hadn't seen since I was a girl, waving at him through base gates. Something like pride, but softer. "You still think I can earn it back?" he asked. "Not all at once," I said, but that was a start. We didn't hug, we didn't need to. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come with applause. It comes in the form of a daughter choosing just once more to believe in the man who raised her. They called me into the operations wing the day after the hearing. Not a summons, not exactly a command. Just a soft ping from Lieutenant Colonel Forbes' assistant asking if I had 10 minutes. I didn't have 10. I had 20. I walked past rows of steel and glass, past officers who'd heard whispers, but now looked me in the eye. Some nodded. Some straightened their backs slightly when I passed. No words were exchanged, but something had shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore. I stepped into Forbes' office. He didn't stand, he didn't need to. His presence did that on its own. But he gestured to the seat across from him, eyes calm, hands folded. "Major Rhodes," he began. "We've been reviewing the after-action reports, yours included." I stayed silent. "We've also reviewed your linguistic record, your analytical file," and he added with the barest smile, "the fact that your translator instincts exposed a breach that none of our automated systems caught." I gave him a half nod. It wasn't pride, I felt just quiet clarity. "Camila," he said, shifting tone, "we'd like to offer you a promotion. Senior Intelligence Advisor to Joint Forces Liaison." I blinked. That was 3 grades above where I stood. A corner office, a dedicated team, a plaque outside the door. "Admiral Ling personally reviewed your footage," Forbes added. "He called you the voice we didn't hear soon enough." His words, I inhaled. It would have been easy to say yes, to let the moment wrap me in a ribbon and call it a reward. To finally be at a table that had always felt 2 inches too high for me. But I didn't say yes. Instead, I asked, "May I speak plainly, sir?" He nodded. "I'm honored," I began. "Truly, but I don't think I'm needed in a bigger room." He raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "I don't need a larger desk," I said slowly. "To do work that matters, I've already learned how to make myself heard without a nameplate. And I've realized I belong where things go unnoticed. where people assume they already know who's important and who isn't. I swallowed before finishing, because that's where the danger creeps in. And that's where someone like me, someone overlooked, can still change the outcome. He didn't respond right away, just studied me. Then to my surprise, he smiled. Understood, he said. You'll remain in your current role, but with clearance expanded. And should you ever change your mind, I'll come find you, I promised. When I left the office, I didn't feel small. I returned to my regular post back among the aides, the runners, the translators with their color-coded folders and half-drunk coffee. Except now people didn't walk past me. They nodded, they asked, they listened. I noticed that even the way people whispered my name had changed. It was no longer the aide from the Spanish unit. It was the one who stopped the attack. The one whose father stood because she did. The one who didn't need a title to carry weight. Later that day, someone placed a new ID badge on my desk. Same rank, same clearance line. But one change at the bottom, a small emblem signifying Special Intelligence Liaison. I smiled. Not because I needed it, but because I knew now I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I walked down the hall to grab another folder for the debrief team. Along the way, a young airman stopped me. "Ma'am," he asked, voice a little nervous. "You're Major Rhodes, right?" I turned. "Yes, I just wanted to say, I saw what you did. What you didn't let go, silent." I nodded gently. "Then don't let your voice go silent either." He nodded, eyes bright. As I continued walking, I passed the old wall of honor, a display of citations, awards, and unit photos. My father's image was still there, years younger, saluting the flag beside his unit in Peru. He looked invincible in that photo. But I knew now real strength wasn't in the picture. It was in the parts he had to rebuild, in the way he stood when everything fell, and maybe, just maybe, in the daughter who chose not to replace him, but to stand beside him quietly and do the work no one else saw coming. It was almost 1900 when I walked past his door. Most nights lately, his light was still on. But tonight it wasn't the desk lamp that made me pause. It was the silence, the kind that holds something unfinished. I knocked once. He didn't say anything, but after a moment he opened the door and stepped aside. No salute, no orders, just a man waiting. He motioned toward his desk. I saw the picture before I saw his eyes. It was me, maybe 21 years old, standing on a tarmac with my first uniform too stiff for comfort, trying to hide how proud I was. The photograph was creased at the edges, like it had been taken in and out of a drawer too many times. "I kept this," he said gently, tapping the corner of the frame. Even when I told myself I shouldn't, I didn't answer. "You look too small for the boots," he added, voice lower. And I told myself that was weakness. I stood still. "Camila," he said, slower now. Like he'd practiced these next words in his head for a long time. I was wrong that day. I sat. He didn't rush. "I thought I was protecting you," he continued. "From war, from disappointment, from men who'd underestimate you because of your voice, your name, your heart." I breathed in, but what I did was worse, he admitted. "I made you question if you belonged." I looked down at the frame. I did belong. I just spent years proving it in rooms you never looked into. He nodded. "I see that now." There was a beat of silence between us. Then I said, not out of anger, just truth. "You were never wrong for wanting me strong, Dad. You were only wrong when you thought you didn't have to apologize." His head lowered. And when he looked back up, his eyes weren't glassy, but they were softer than I remembered. "Camila," he said, his voice steadier than I expected. "You've always had more spine than I knew what to do with. But lately I've realized spine wasn't what made you who you are." I waited. "You listened when no one else did. You caught what I missed. And when the world doubted you, you didn't scream. You didn't fight to be seen. You just kept standing." My throat tightened. "I've saluted a lot of heroes in my life," he continued, voice lowering again. "But I never thought the one I needed to thank most would be my daughter." He turned back to his desk and opened the drawer. He took something out and placed it in front of me. It was my old ID badge, encased now in a polished wooden frame. It still said Aide, Spanish translator, Camila Rhodes. The corner was scuffed from when I dropped it in the mud on our first joint op. He said, "They'll change your title. Someday maybe even your rank. But none of that is why I respect you." Then he stepped around the desk. And before I could process it, he did something he had never done in my entire life. He reached out and touched my shoulder gently, like the weight wasn't just in the gesture, but in everything unspoken behind it. You held the line, he whispered. Not just for your country, but for me. And then he smiled, not the proud colonel, not the sharp-tongued mentor, just my father. My keystone, he said softly. Thank you for holding the world together while I almost let it fall apart. It was the first time he said my call sign, without sarcasm, without mockery, without doubt. I felt something inside me settle, because sometimes the most important recognition doesn't come from a medal, a press release, or even a promotion. Sometimes it comes from the man who taught you to salute, finally returning the gesture, not with his hand, but with his heart. And that night as I walked away, I didn't cry. But I looked at that old photo in my mind again, and this time I didn't see a rookie in oversized boots. I saw a daughter who stayed, who stood, and who finally was seen. It was just after 700. The mess hall was mostly empty except for a few early risers and one man who always woke before the world asked him to. Derek sat at the far end by the window, a steaming mug already in hand. He hadn't touched the eggs on his plate. That wasn't unusual. He saw me and gave a small nod. I slid into the seat across from him, the weight of the last few weeks settling softly over the table between us, like morning light. We didn't say anything for a while. Just the clink of cutlery, distant boots on concrete, and the hum of a room too tired for noise. Then Derek reached across the table and rested his hand on mine. His palm was rough, same calluses, same steady grip, but today it carried something quieter than comfort. Respect. You didn't just save the colonel, he said, voice barely louder than the coffee machine behind us. You saved your father. I didn't answer right away. He waited. Then I looked out the window, watching the light shift on the flight line outside. Crews were already prepping for the next round of flights. The world keeps moving even when your own has barely started breathing again. I think he was always waiting for me to prove something, I finally said. But this time, it wasn't about proving I was right. He leaned in, slightly curious. I continued. It was about proving I'd stay, even when it hurt. Derek didn't try to spin it into a compliment or a pep talk. That was what I loved about him. He knew the difference between needing to be heard and needing to be fixed. I used to think being keystone meant holding things together, I said. Fingers brushing the edge of my cup. Now I think it means being willing to carry the weight when others can't, and letting go when they're ready. He exhaled slowly, a little amused. That's a lot of meaning for one call sign. I smiled. Well, the name stuck. He gave a soft chuckle. You know, I remember the first time I saw you in uniform. You were behind two brass talking like you weren't even there. Then one of them asked where the report was, and you already had it printed, translated, and tabbed. I thought, that woman, she's the one keeping this place from tipping over. And you didn't say anything. I wasn't stupid, he said. I knew you'd notice. I noticed. We laughed quietly but fully. Then his tone softened again. You've always been good, Camila. But this time, you didn't just navigate chaos, you brought truth into it. You stayed when you had every reason to run. You chose clarity over pride, justice over vengeance. He paused. And somehow you did it without losing the parts of you that made you human. I didn't cry. But the words landed where tears used to live. He squeezed my hand again. And now I thought for a moment. I don't need a bigger desk, I said, or more stripes on my shoulder. I just need to know that when I walk into a room, I bring the kind of steadiness that holds the mission together. He tilted his head. That sounds a lot like someone who understands legacy. I nodded. Maybe I do. We finished breakfast slowly. We weren't in a rush anymore. As the sun edged higher through the windows, I caught a reflection in the glass, just the faintest outline of myself in uniform, sitting upright, clear-eyed, grounded. For years I had measured my worth by how well I blended in, how smoothly I supported others, how invisible I could be while making everything run. But now I wasn't invisible. I was steady, known, trusted, and not because I demanded to be seen, but because I showed up when it mattered, because I spoke when it counted, because I stood between collapse and consequence, and held. I turned back to Derek. You know what the colonel called me yesterday? He raised an eyebrow. He said, my keystone. No sarcasm, no smirk. Derek smiled. I added it wasn't a victory. It was a return of something we both lost and finally found again. We stood to leave. He took both our trays. As I walked out, I looked up. The base flag rippled above us, strong, wind-high sky. No one saluted, no ceremony. But I didn't need any of that to know who I was. I was Camila Rhodes. I was Keystone. And once again, I'd kept the bridge from falling. I used to be a shadow behind a signature, a silent aide in the corner of briefing rooms, holding folders no one cared to ask about unless they were late. They called me junior paper pusher support staff. But I knew how to listen between the lines. I knew how to see what others dismissed. And when the moment came when chaos crept in disguised as routine, I said one sentence, just one. And it saved a life. Not because I shouted or slammed a gavel or carried rank enough to silence a room, but because I knew when to speak and who needed to hear it. That's the thing about silence. It's not always weakness. Sometimes it's the only clear voice in the room full of noise. Sometimes your quiet decision is the bell that keeps the bridge from collapsing. People look at strength like it's loud, like it commands attention. But I've learned it doesn't have to be. Strength can be steady, strength can be still, strength can wait until it matters. And when it does, when truth and timing align, you don't have to raise your voice. You just have to stand. I'm still not the highest-ranking officer on base. I don't have medals you'll read about in the papers. But I've held this place together. I've seen men ready to die for their pride. I've seen fathers fall short and still choose to rise. I've stood between accusation and redemption, and didn't let either swallow us whole. That's what it means to be Keystone. Not the biggest stone, not the strongest, but the one shaped precisely to hold everything else together. And that is enough. So if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, unimportant, let me tell you this. Sometimes the person who turns the tide is not the one with the mic, but the one with the map. Sometimes the one who prevents a war never fires a shot. Sometimes the miracle isn't loud. It's the steady hand, the second look, the whispered warning. If you have that voice inside you, the quiet instinct that says this isn't right, or say it now, don't ignore it. Don't wait for permission to matter. Use your silence wisely. Use it to notice, to understand, to hold firm when the room wavers. And when the time comes, let that silence break with purpose. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know something. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company while the world slows down? Let us know in the comments. I promise we read every single one with gratitude. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you miss, someone you forgave, or someone you want to become, please consider subscribing to this channel. Not just to hear more stories like mine, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, whatever uniform you've worn or burdens you've carried, I hope you carry this story with you, not as a caution, but as a reminder that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly, patiently, until you're ready to open your heart. And when you do, it walks in, like a daughter who finally speaks, like a father who finally listens, like silence turning into a second chance. Take care. We'll see you in the next story.